Pattie Boyd was described as the great love of your life. True?
I don't know, Ed.
This is Pattie Boyd, a model pictured here in 1964 and married to George Harrison. This is Eric Clapton. He was George Harrison's best friend.
How did I get to meet him?
No, but how did you meet? No, how did you decide?
We shared the same wife.
Pattie inspired some of the most powerful love songs ever written, including Layla, an album written by Eric Clapton professing his love for Pattie, of course his best friend's wife. But what happened that led George and Eric to write this amazing music for her? And did it work for Eric? Well, kind of. It's a crazy story about a crazy lifestyle that didn't end well for anyone.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
The story begins in 1964 when Pattie Boyd was hired to appear in the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night. George took an instant liking to her, but at the time she was already seeing someone else, Eric Swain. But after telling her friends about her meeting with George, she returned to tell him that she'd broken up with Eric and they could go for dinner. They got married 2 years later in 1966, and after the Beatles stopped touring in the same year, they managed to find a lifestyle that actually suited them quite well. They both had an interest in spirituality and vegetarianism, and for a while it looked as though it would be a happy marriage that would last a long time, despite the intense lifestyle that came with being a Beatle. George's first meeting with Eric Clapton was also in 1964, when the Yardbirds, Eric's band at the time, was invited to support the Beatles at a gig in London. All four of the Beatles were there, but it was George and Eric that hit it off straight away, mostly because of their mutual admiration and love of the guitar. But at this time, the Beatles were stars, unlike Eric, and so it would take a while until they really became close. Eric saw himself less as a pop star and more as a serious blues musician. Whenever pop success came his way, he tended to shy away from it, maybe even look down on it. Instead, he was drawn more towards serious guitar playing and blues music.
By the time they came around, I was already deeply ensconced in hardcore blues, and I'm becoming a purist very fast.
George, being part of the Beatles, was incredibly famous, but he had this longing to be a respected guitar player, something more like Eric. Their friendship continued to grow, and at one point George invited Eric over to Abbey Road Studios to play on one of the Beatles songs, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. This was quite surprising because not many people played on Beatles records, especially guitar because George was the Beatles' guitarist. But it seemed as though George was starting to distance himself away from the Beatles and more towards the guitar world that Eric was associated with. He was also proving his chops as a songwriter, writing songs such as Here Comes the Sun and Something, which was written for his wife, Pattie. Frank Sinatra called this the greatest love song ever written.
It's one of the best love songs, I believe, to be written in 50 or 100 years, and it never says, I love you in the song, but it really is one of the finest.
The 1960s was a busy period for Eric, but not in the same way as it was for George. The 60s for George was of course dominated by the Beatles, which more or less kept him on a steady path. But for Eric, things were very different. Eric joined the Yardbirds, a rhythm and blues band, in 1963, and he stayed with them for 2 years until 1965. He briefly played with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers before forming Cream in 1966 with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. It was with Cream that he found the most mainstream success. They stayed together until 1968, and then in 1969 he formed Blind Faith, where they recorded just one album. By the end of the decade, both George and Eric found themselves in unique positions looking for something else out of life. George wanted to further explore his interest in spirituality, and this led him to become more distant and isolated from his wife, Pattie. In fact, his interest was so strong that after returning from a trip to India, he wanted to be like the god Krishna, always surrounded by young women. Eric, however, was looking to settle down somewhere, in contrast to his ever-changing and hectic lifestyle of the 60s. And so he found his place in Surrey, Hurtwood Edge. It was a peaceful and solitary place where he'd live for many years to come. Musically, this was a very important time for Eric. He discovered the music of J.J. Cale, who'd become a major influence throughout his career, and he formed the band Derek and the Dominos, which he'd later called the greatest rhythm section he'd ever play with. He also began seeing a lot more of George and his wife Pattie, as they lived only a 30-minute drive away. So they'd come over, they'd write songs, and they'd have dinner. It was clear that Eric had taken a liking to Pattie, and with George becoming more distant in their marriage, it was difficult for Pattie to resist this attention. 1970, they occasionally began seeing each other more often. Secret meetings would take place in London or in Guildford, close to where they lived. And it was at one of these meetings where Eric played a record for Pattie of a song he just recorded. The song was Layla. She described it as one of the most powerful songs she's ever heard. It was about a young man that falls hopelessly in love with a woman, but she's unavailable. This, of course, was how Eric felt about Pattie.
I thought that this is such a public declaration of his feelings for me, and I wasn't really ready for it. In fact, I wasn't ready at all for it, because I still hadn't made up my mind whether George and I could get back on track.
But after hearing the song and knowing how Eric felt, it made it difficult to resist. Later that evening, Pattie was at a party at North London where Eric was also attending. George didn't want to go, so he wasn't there, but he did turn up later, and when he arrived, he saw Eric and Pattie talking in the garden. He went over and asked, "What's going on?" To which Eric replied, "I'm in love with your wife."
I remember being out in the garden with Eric at one point, and then George appeared from nowhere and said to Eric, "What are you doing? What's happening?" And then that's when Eric said, "I'm in love with your wife."
What was that moment like?
Awful. I just wanted the earth to swallow me up.
George was furious and asked Pattie, "Are you going with Eric or are you coming home with me?" Pattie left the party and went home with George, but this made George even more distant. The next time she met Eric, he offered a similar ultimatum, but despite her feelings about the music, she again declined, and Eric went into a long period of isolation. They didn't see each other again for 3 years.
She's gone. It's too late, yeah. My baby's gone.
After failing to win her over, Eric went into a self-imposed exile. Derek and the Dominoes broke up, he retired from touring, and just went into isolation inside his Hurtwood home. He didn't leave the house, he didn't pick up the phone, instead he just descended into oblivion. And other than a few compilations and live albums, he didn't release any new music until 1974's 461 Ocean Boulevard. There were a small number of live appearances, such as at George Harrison's Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, but he actually passed out on stage. Then there was the Rainbow Concert, which was organised by his friends in 1973 in an attempt to get him clean. And finally, by 1974, he was able to get clean, at least off the stronger stuff. But it was at this time that his drinking became a lot heavier. For George and Pattie, the 70s weren't much better either. Musically, things were going well for George. In 1970, he released his first solo album, All Things Must Pass. The following year, he organised the Concert for Bangladesh, which, as we know, Eric just about took part in. And in 1973, he had another #1 album, Living in the Material World. But for their marriage, it wasn't so good. They'd already begun to grow apart, and George was getting even further involved in meditation and was having numerous affairs, including with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. Eric and Pattie had already started speaking again, and once again he professed his love for her. But this time, things were different. The marriage was going from bad to worse, and she clearly wasn't happy married to George. Eric went out on tour in the US, and this time she decided to go with him.
Well, hello, old friend. It's really good to see you once again. Hello, old friend. Really good to see you once again.
But this wasn't an easy time, not by any means. She felt lost and confused, and instead of feeling free and independent, she just became more attached to Eric and his touring lifestyle. This, of course, meant lots of drinking. The Beatles hadn't toured since 1966, and Pattie hadn't joined them before that anyway, so this was her first experience on tour, and she didn't know what to expect. This being Eric Clapton in the mid-70s, it was certainly intense. Eric would be partying all day and all through the night, and sometimes he'd play a show just lying on his back. And for Pattie, well, she assumed this was the touring lifestyle and she wanted to be part of it. But Eric was at one of his lowest points, and sadly, Pattie had gone down with him.
You wanna hang out, you got to take her out. Okay.
When they returned home, things didn't get much easier either. It seems bizarre that Eric had wanted Pattie for so long. At this point, they'd known each other for 8 or 9 years. And instead of cherishing this time when they were finally together, things were going from bad to worse. Eric was drinking more than ever, and he'd go off on tour and he wouldn't let Pattie come with him. And so, yet again feeling lost and confused, she went to spend some time in America with her friends and family. At this point, she didn't expect to see Eric ever again. Until one night, there was a phone call and it was from Eric, and he asked her to marry him. Reluctantly, she said yes, and they got married the following Friday. But what's even more incredible is the story of how this came about. It later turned out that Eric had placed a bet with a friend, Roger Forrester, that he couldn't get his name in the following day's newspaper. And so Roger called up the Daily Mail and told them that Eric Clapton would be marrying Pattie Boyd. The following day, it was printed in the paper, and everyone knew about the marriage, apart from Pattie. They got married almost immediately, and instead of going on a honeymoon, she joined Eric on tour for a few nights. That was until Eric told her that he wanted her to go home. Less than a week into their spontaneous marriage, and things were going back to how they were. And what's more, Eric's drinking was again getting worse. Despite all this, there was a strong connection between the two of them, and despite the infidelity, the emotional connection between the two of them was strong. Until one night at dinner, Eric told Pattie that whilst he'd been in Italy, he'd met someone else, and this time it was more intimate. Eric and Pattie had unsuccessfully been trying for children for a long time, and now Eric was going to have a child with someone else.
Well, that came about quite out of the blue. I met this young lady, and bang, it happened. It was like the baby was looking for parents to give it life.
This truly broke Pattie's heart, and so she finally left. The story of George, Pattie and Eric is fascinating, but it's even more incredible to look at the music from this time. It really allows us to understand how they were feeling, and to feel the intense emotion poured into this music. It's no wonder that Something, George's most successful song, was written about Pattie, who at the time he was truly in love with.
I'm deeply, deeply honoured that George wrote that seriously beautiful song. And I think what's happened, with time, it has become more iconic. Because when I first heard it, it's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
But then the more you hear it, the more it just gets to you because it's so beautiful.
And Layla was also Eric's most successful song, and I think some of the best music to come out of his entire career. And then there are other songs too, such as Bell Bottom Blues and Wonderful Tonight, and it's amazing how this music is so personal and yet so universal to all of us.
People find it very difficult to understand, therefore, why you and he are still mates, why didn't it damage your relationship?
Well, it did. I mean, it dented our relationship, and it has, there's been a lot of times when it's gone up and down.
Music has this unique power to communicate our feelings and connect us with others. And although the story of the three of them is heartbreaking, it has left us with some amazing music.
I actually see, we all see one another still. And we're like a tight little family, really.
Do you still love Pattie?
Very much.